So I'm going to be reading part of my paper, and I'm also going to be presenting PowerPoints, and then I'm going to be switching because I thought, okay, at this point, before lunch, maybe you want to see some pictures of populists already, and perhaps not only be read at. So, proposing a challenge to the status quo when it emerges, populism is often seen as the antithesis of democracy. Think tanks, parties, and institutions are faced with the challenge of populism, and they try to find answers to it. Political scientists try to be helpful in responding to the challenge to the party system, but as new parties are emerging and old ones are transforming rapidly, they are unable to fit them into the existing cleavages, interests and party groups, the nicely laid out party spectrum, where representation was tied first to class and then to interest, is, should I say, finally crumbling. The commentators seek to define the basis of populist parties, drawing on their contents and a support base. For instance, the heartlands argument, globalization is effective argument, and they are trying to generate or find new interests or cleavages, recognize them in society. Often in the cases we see populism synonymous with nationalism. Others see that this is a thin ideology that ties the parties together, centering upon the articulation of people against the elite, and some seek to explain populism through mediatization or crisis rhetoric without much content of its own. Following Ernst Laclau, populism is not an ideology, as we know from yesterday already, or much before, but a logic of articulation without content. And here I'm stressing this without content in the presentation. It articulates an abstract us that becomes the people, even when it is not explicitly called the people, I should add. Crucial is the founding moment, the catachristical moment in rhetoric, which is why this can be seen as a post-foundationalist approach. Populism is about generating a dichotomy and an us, this dichotomy and an us out of heterogeneous elements. Articulation is central to politics, and it provides this necessary glue for voters and supporters, the movements, their leaders, slogans, common headers, frontiers. It also includes this notion of affect that is often missing when we are not talking about populism as articulation. This is also visible in this sort of way that the dichotomy is defining our identity, or the us. The problem of traditional political parties is that they have forgotten that they are political movements, or they should be, they were at some point political movements. They do not simply occupy particular positions and statically keep hold of their unchanging base, but at least they shouldn't do that. Early on, already in the 80s and maybe the 70s, Laclau realized this issue that most political scientists have been ignoring even today and refusing to accept. On the other hand, also the parties are refusing to accept, and consequently they suffer from this decline in support, membership and legitimacy. There is no automatic mandate in politics. So I follow this line of Ernst and Chantal that is basically seeing populism as part and parcel of any political movement and necessary for democracy. Commentators, for instance, Benjamin Arditi and Nadia Urbinati, have been suggesting that this perspective is not as useful as it reduces politics to populism, or it is downright dangerous. I'd like to consider some of this criticism here and seek to explore the matter a bit more. I should also say in the presence of Chantal that this is not a paper on radical democracy. I said this for another occasion. Some of the colleagues have already heard me this spring. But the aim of the paper is to kind of package this 10, 8 years work, perhaps even 15 years of work, to explore how an anti-essentialist and post-foundationalist understanding of populism works. Or does it work? I mean, this is the question that you should keep in mind. So, I was presenting this paper also earlier this spring for an audience of comparative politics people, and I tried to put forward an argument about an anti-essentialist comparative politics approach. It's really difficult because the terms that we tend to use assume some content always, and so this is the difficulty. Here, populism is understood with some minimal content. So, which is pretty much presented here. I agree with some of the commentators that in this abstract form, populism is not always, the take on populism is not always helpful. I also think that often, in the occasions when populism is discussed, we should rather discuss nativism, racism, and authoritarianism. But at the same time, we should pay attention to the origins of those so-called populist movements and the ways in which they may or may not have included the populist logic of articulation in their rhetoric and mobilization. Why and how they emerged, what is the glue that they offer, apart from this kind of demagogy. Furthermore, I insist that we look at populist movements in the context of other political movements, the field on which they make their move. Empirical research should also explore this discursive field on which populist movements are operating and their impact on it. Political theory that we are now celebrating here with Oliver does not emerge in a vacuum or a theoretical bubble. At least good political theory doesn't. The argument I put forward here that seeks to enhance the understanding of populism is really based on this long-term work on Hungary from the early 2000s, and also in Finland, where I returned in 2008, and where I've been acting kind of as a public intellectual and taking part in an Academy of Finland project on populism as movement and rhetoric, reading newspapers from the early 2000s as well. Observing politics in Austria and the US, for instance, I have found my argument useful, but now you're going to be having to judge it for yourself. So this is this is something that you have already seen. I'm proposing a couple of analytical concepts that are based on Ernesto's theory, and they do not only apply to the nominally populist parties or parties who call themselves populist, but they enable reflection on any political movement that fits this criterion. So first I'm asking, what is the extent of populism? And I'm presenting you here. Oops. Do you want to say that? This argument about pure populism and pure institutionalism that my PhD student Halil Kurhalli in Finland has proposed. So the question is, how much populism do we need? And can there be too much populism? As for Ernesto, populism is the antithesis of institutionalism. There seems to be this kind of line between pure populism and pure institutionalism. This is Halil's articulation of it. And the actual populism, drawings, sorry. The actual populisms take place here. So the problem of populism relies in the abstract necessity of it. Laclau discussed both the distinction between pure populism and pure institutionalism and the degree to which parties are populist, briefly, but this has been largely ignored in the attempts to distinguish and recognize populisms, which, by the way, is equally futile as the attempts to recognize and distinguish discourses per se. This argument here tries to capture the problems discussed by Arditi and Urminati. And reading Laclau currently explains why the connection of populism and politics is relevant precisely because in pure institutionalism there are no attempts to articulate the various demands and positions. The glue is lacking. The empirical cases that we have been working on at the University of Helsinki on Hungary and Turkey demonstrate how when the logic of polarization and populism becomes the only name in the game, we are shifting away from populism as something with a democratic ethos. In Turkey, Erdogan is the example that kind of emerges as the only nodal point in the field to be identified with or against. In Hungary, the line between the left and right, so-called, became the decisive point for all political contestation and identification around the year 2000. Pure populism denies the identity of the others as legitimate and reduces all differences under the heading that populist rhetoric and movement offers. So everything is reduced into this empty signifier. When all emerging demands are constantly and permanently articulated to a particular demand or a symbol which constitutes the identities of those whom it represents and those whom it opposes, what was originally somewhat a populist movement has advanced to pure populism. The situation appears frozen, whereas usually in politics there would be multiple contestations, new lines of differentiation, new symbols, and new coming together, emerging. There will be still articulation in this pure populism, unlike in institutionalism, but the pattern is permanently fixed. This situation is far from the agonism that Chantal has been discussing and far from the ethos of radical democracy. One could also say that political as the art of contingency, as it is in the kind of Machiavellian rhetoric-inspired accounts, or the art of the articulation of demands into equivalential chains and generating empty signifiers, that also includes this contingency in the Laclau-inspired accounts, is missing as the frontier becomes so fixed that it becomes institutionalized. So if we think about Erdogan, we can see that pure populism has turned him into something else than a populist, even if populist logics are still sometimes evoked. He is a right-wing authoritarian leader with a personality cult, but the populist logics may appear to some of the supporters and in the political rhetoric. So this works as a really good illustration, but as with most continuums, or many of them, this is actually a loop. So it may become a loop, so these two extents of it meet each other. So now we've established this importance of looking at the extent or degree of populism. Of course, the situation is rarely frozen, but in flux. But what has caught commentators by surprise is that we are actually dealing with populism, and when we are dealing with populism, we are dealing with a moving target. When one has managed to fix the understanding of populism, as the younger Emilia has now fixed an understanding of populism, it starts evolving. So when we have recognized, oh, these are the populists, maybe they soon are not populist anymore. Or some others have also started developing the same characteristics of populism. tackle with this contingency, we will now explore what I have termed populist dynamics, which will be helpful in defining these situations in which populism is emerging. They are analytical concepts of, perhaps, ideal types. You should help me out with this. I'm not as Webererian as some other Palonen people. To deal with the reality of these populist movements and the way in which they have impact on each other. So I'm not having one ideal type, I'm offering three. Fringe populism. Most often populism appears as coming from the side of the political spectrum and challenging the whole set of established political parties. Fringe populism do not necessarily articulate a particular policy content, but challenges the mainstream. Challenging the mainstream is enough for them. So in contrast to new parties, this is literature on new parties, at the heart of their rhetoric is the founding of the people, rather than just offering a new idea on the political spectrum space, one demand. So they articulate many of them and at the same time found the people. So usually it is the silent majority that doesn't get represented elsewhere, or it may appear as the loud minority that seeks to get their voices through to the misled mainstream. As populist parties, they also generate a number of demands, but their focus is on the frontier. So here, this is the fringe populism, and that's where the other political movements are. And they are articulating this frontier. That's their idea. Okay, examples, you need examples. In Finland, the Finnish party is a great example of this. They attack all the other parties in the name of representing the silent majority. Already the name, the Finnish party, the direct translation would have been basic Finns, or perussuomalaiset. It suggests the claim that they're representing those who wouldn't otherwise be represented, or the real people, and that there are some elite in power who's not representing them. That's quite simple, but when you look at Timo Soini's opinion pieces in the National Daily in Finland from 2002 to 2011, as I did, you realize that he has this particular skill of making a number of arguments, or at least bringing in a number of elements or even demands in the same piece. In 2002, the core of his argument was to demand EU funding for those parties also who are not, who don't have representatives at the European Parliament, claiming that there is democratic deficit in the system. At the same time, he had become famous for the slogan, "Where's the EU, there is a problem." So these kind of incompatible demands. He was not alone articulating a position of the party. My research on the articulation of Finnish party in these opinion pieces and columns indicate that the journalist commentators took up on this point of democratic deficit, this kind of problematization, because it resonated with their own analysis and the government's policy on democracy, as response to the falling turnout rates at the elections. So the journalists had been briefed by the ministry to actually make people vote more. And for them, the journalists, the Finnish party vote was breath of fresh air in an actual quotation, in contrast to the established parties who did not really offer alternatives, and these are also could be quoted directly. So they made this kind of movement reading of this situation. So I don't know whether they read Chantal, but the situation was presented in this way. The irony was that Finnish party was not a really new party, but founded upon the Finnish rural party, which had gone bankrupt. The charismatic leader Veikko Vennamo wanted to give voice to those who hadn't been heard arguing famously that the people know. It was a Putadist party, relatively strong in the 60s and the 80s, and the Finns party, particularly the former boxer and MP. You can't really review somebody like that, but yes, Tony Halme, came from the Helsinki suburbs, and he updated this fringe populism to include the suburbs of Finland. The people who had whose ancestors came from rural parts and now were living in the suburbs. This not included in the debates as one element. In the 80s in Finland there was another French populist party that made its move. The Green Party, for many, seemed to offer the alternative to mainstream parties in addition to the environmentalist issues that it brought on. So it was never really a real single issue party, although some of the demands are adopted in the mainstream. It had not withered away due to its status. There were always populist elements. Now they are returning more strongly to this populist logic of articulation, moving away from this expert technocrat position and generating this range of demands that would include social justice and democracy. And they are going beyond this discourse on rights that they had before. This would be interesting. Okay, forgot to show you Timo Soini. Now you can be looking at him because I don't have a picture of Pekka Haavisto, the presidential candidate in our last elections from the Green Party or other. Yeah. So also I should mention that in the Finns party there were multiple demands, and some of the demands were from the extreme right, but it wasn't. It was like Timo Soini was always the one who would be talking about democracy and generally the people, and then there would be this added value of having Jussi Halla-aho, who is an MEP for Finland now, in there. So they have been able to bring this agenda in. So now about the Green Party. They are now talking about basic income and enhancing democracy and having these radical proposals that also challenge the idea of the centre. Now I should move to Hungary. Okay. I should have a picture here about Jobbik. But they are always coming in a way in the shadow of Fidesz, which was the original Fringe populist party. I'll first talk about Jobbik. They have a real following, not because they have all kinds of militarist, xenophobic and anti-Semitist ideas and calls for real Hungary. They are particularly strong in the countryside, where they're presenting an alternative to all established parties. It's not the first attempt in Hungary. In fact, in the early 2000s, the Centre Party and the Liberals tried to do the same, and they miserably failed because of competing populism. That's something to talk about later. Jobbik managed to symbolically represent itself as different from the other parties. They go and engage with the villagers, looking like the locals and sounding like locals, unlike the Fidesz candidates in suits just before the elections. They include all kinds of social elements too. Perhaps some in the audience remember this early 90s and the Hungarian Life and Justice Party, MIED. That was, in contrast to Jobbik, not ever a populist party. They were a nationalist party who sometimes played this French argument, but their leader István Csurka was actually part of the elite. He had been one of the people involved in roundtable talks and initiated the new system with constitution and free elections in 1990, so it's part of that gap. In the early 1990s, Fidesz was a French populist party, this here. Viktor Orbán presented this alternative opposing all the existing parties that had formed the basis of those roundtable talks. And this is where the revolutionary rhetoric still comes from. he's claiming that everybody else was part of this transition that wasn't a revolution, and in 2010 he could argue that he's the face of the revolution. So 2010, face of the revolution. Yeah. It had these fringe elements, and it also the discourse also included them later. So, for instance, this idea originally of having age limit on the party was an example of like this coming from the fringe, but then he realized quite cleverly that that's not going to be taking him to become a mainstream populist party that he then became. So he led the party to become. They fostered this idea of civic culture and polgaröver. That term included both his civic bourgeois elements and kind of future, progressive, future-oriented element in Hungarian. And that was a near perfect empty signifier, but it failed because in 2002 the socialists won the elections, and this kind of bourgeois habitus perhaps was too much for the voters, and perhaps this banal nationalism as well. So then he ended up playing this fringe card again, even if he was a mainstream populist, engaging or not engaging from outside the parliament. So he didn't attend the parliamentary sessions for a couple of years, and then they had these national consultations that they still run, trying to find out what the people really think. They are totally not transparent, but this is the way in which they are arguing that they know what the people are wanting, and this is it. And they managed to somehow articulate the representation of the people. I think at the moment it is quite difficult because, or quite easy. It has been quite easy because the left has been in ruins. But so fringe populism are challenged from outside, an anti-system. Here are some fringe populists. The emergence of new populist parties, and then mainstream populists that generates an antagonistic frontier with the past or something else rather than defining the other very clearly, or at least they do not co-constitute each other like in the competing populism. I have still an example from Finland. The current commissioner for Finland, Jyrki Katainen, and his National Coalition party were able to present kind of this feel-good populism takeover signifiers from the left, such as the Working People's President campaign, and they were really successful in articulating this emptiness that was a uniting force until the bubble broke, and the Centre Party that had been in the opposition between 2011 and 2015 managed to articulate a similar drive and adopt this position. So it should be moving on to the understanding of competing populisms. That denotes this bipolarity of the party field. There are two parties that, or groups that generate their self-image through the other and keep the self rather unidentified. So you would have this lack of internal contestation as the consequence of this frozen political frontier, because the attention is given on the establishment of that frontier. And here you have competing populism in Hungary in 2000-2010. It's a bit difficult to explain because at the moment you don't have competing populism in the same way, because Fidesz is trying to integrate all the arguments of Jobbik, the other strong party, and the left. It used to be Hungarian Socialist Party, and it used to be the Liberal Party with them. But now all the former prime ministers, they have their own parties. So the lack of left populism in Hungary is a problem for the system. So it's also difficult because people do not believe in this strong contestation between the left and right as well, because for years they became kind of victims of that. The elites just were holding power, shifting from one to the other, not really having any effects on policies, not really engaging people really. So it's very difficult for the left to have these attempts at generating a new coalition. Later on, there's left-wing populism. Also because communism was so discredited, so many of the symbols that are being used by left populist parties in elsewhere in Europe might also be put in question. So we should be taking seriously this the field on which populist parties are operating. The populism in different parties that could be fringe or mainstream or then competing. We should also, oops, that's a bit down here. We could also see that this analytical division between different populisms could be tied to other sort of readings of populism, like the crisis argument, that in these different populisms there would be different response to the crisis. Of course, we could be seeing that crisis is not the crisis is actually discursively constructed, and that there's a transformation from one dynamic or position to another. So for instance, because in Hungary we are missing this kind of healthy part of competing populism, Fidesz is also all the time generating the other in other ways. So building of the wall, responding to this immigration crisis or the influx of immigrants in Hungary through his anti-immigration rhetoric. So he's able to always re-articulate the crisis. Previously, it was about like that the terrible idea that the left would be in power, and then it would be a crisis. And now it's these kind of other factors that are there. How am I doing with time? Still some time. So what we have been looking at in this news project is the spread of populist articulation beyond party politics. So if you buy this kind of anti-essentialist thesis, you can be looking at this dichotomous speech and emptiness in the production of the myths and symbols, imaginaries that actually include the frontier elsewhere. And that's what we've been doing, developing this kind of a discursive intersectional analysis with some cultural studies people. It's also a bit jumping, but I had to return back to democracy. There's no such a thing as non-normative theory, as Sam Chambers says. So, of course, there's also some sort of a normative element here, that we have problems with fringe populism. At the same time, we need fringe populism sometimes to challenge the system. What kind of fringe populism it is like a really good question. And is it based on agonism or antagonism? Is the other defined essentialistically? Is the us defined in a pluralist way? How do we respond to these fringe populisms when they are emerging, and the grounds on which they have been founded? Then on mainstream populism, should we be as political actors producing this emptiness, or producing pluralism and some sort of moments of emptiness that are necessary for this togetherness, the usness to emerge? because the problem for democracy or populism is also that the mainstream populists may turn totally empty, so that they wouldn't be really representing demands. So there would be a dimension of the signifier present, but the demands wouldn't be articulated clearly. Also, what sort of discursive change that would be highlighted on the field. Then competing populisms, is this frontier fixed or is it temporary? And the problem that I saw with populism in this polarization is that the frontier was fixed and it seemed permanent, and it became kind of like institutionalized. So we ended up in a situation of pure populism that could be also almost pure institutionalism. Are these frontiers contingent? Are they articulated time and again in slightly different positions? And how is the other seen? Is the other seen as legitimate or not? So here, this was this attempt to articulate a reading of Ernst Laclau's theory, perhaps also Chantal's, you can correct me, where I go on this side, from an anti-essentialist and post-foundationalist way. I should stress that here I also follow in the post-foundationalist argument something like a Derridian line that I have inherited somehow from my uncle Emilia Palonen, that is seeing politics as active and these active moments rather than looking at the sort of meta-level discourses and the sort of meta-level institution or founding of politics. So that's made me look at this also in instances of articulation in different rhetorical moments.